Today, we've got a special treat for you. We'll be diving into an exciting transformation where we take a vintage vanity and make it into two tall and skinny nightstands. They're perfect for small bedrooms. We're giving them a full revamp with some elbow grease and a bit of patience, and our favorite tools and paints. So if you've been itching for a new project, or if you just love seeing old furniture get a fresh and fabulous makeover, then stick around. This one's gonna be fun. Here's where the vintage vanity started. Our neighbor and friend gave it to us knowing what we do. She had painted it with latex paint, I think, that honestly held up pretty well. I've been looking for tall and skinny nightstands for our kids' bedroom, so this is the perfect piece for me. First, I took apart the vanity. I looked around for the screws or any signs of how this middle part was attached to the sides. Thankfully, I found screws on the back side and took them out with my electric screwdriver. None of them were stripped, and they came out pretty easily. There were also screws under the middle area, so I removed the middle drawer, set it aside, and then removed those screws. They were a little bit harder to remove because I couldn't see where the line in the screw was, and there was paint in some of the screw heads, but once they were loose, I gently pulled it, and it all came off, except for this one last piece. How is this held on? So I hit it with the hammer a couple of times, and it didn't budge. So it must have been held on really well somewhere. I could not see any other signs of it being held on, but when I removed another drawer, I found bolts coming inside the drawer right where the middle piece was secured. So I loosened the bolts from the inside of the drawer with a universal ratchet that fit around the square nut, and I slowly was able to loosen it. I felt so good when all of it just finally came apart. Last but not least, I chiseled off the remaining little piece of wood and took off some of the veneer with it. So here's what I was left with. Each nightstand had just a few holes to fill, but also they had these large cutouts in the corners that I'm not about to just paint over. So I filled them in. I've had this JB Weld epoxy putty for years. It's very similar to Quickwood, but it came in a much larger container. I don't personally care for it, I don't think as much as the Quickwood, but it still gets the job done. I would have just taken these out to the garage and filled the corner in with some Bondo. But Bondo is stinky and I work inside my home when it's cold outside. Plus, this was honestly a great excuse to just get rid of this filler I've had around for years. I used all of it and still needed some holes filled, so I used the Quickwood for the holes, and then I used plastic wood filler for the chipped veneer. The next day, I came back to the project to sand down all of the wood filler. I used 120 grit screens at first, but the epoxy putty was soft enough that it was clogging the sandpaper, so I just switched to the cheaper and more aggressive 60 grit Diablo discs. This was another great chance to test out my new Rotex 125 sander that is more aggressive than any other sander I know, other than belt sanders. Eventually, I got everything sanded down smooth, but unfortunately, some of the veneer chipped again, so I had to fill that back in. Now, these nightstands were painted with a brush, and as I sanded the filler, it progressed to sanding off the brush marks out of the paint. I think this paint is latex, which doesn't help because it clogs sandpaper easily because it gums up when it's sanded. Sanding was a slow process, so I sprayed some QCS Stripwell stripper onto the other nightstand while I sanded the first nightstand. I ended up spraying 2 coats of it on, letting it sit for about 15 minutes each after each coat, but the paint still wasn't budging much with just a regular plastic scraper. So I got out the strong carbide scraper. This thing removed most of the paint without too much effort on my part because the chemical stripper softened the paint up. I scraped my little heart out for a few hours before calling it quits for the night.
Okay, it is the next day, and I have made a mess. I ended up stripping off a lot of this old finish. These had so much texture on them. There was a lot of brush marks everywhere, and I don't like brush marks, so I wanted to get rid of that. But basically at this point, I just need to smooth the finish out. I've gotten most of the brush marks and stuff out. Now I just need to smooth things. And I don't know, maybe I made it worse for myself, but sanding all of the brush marks out was taking a long time and it was clogging up a lot of sandpaper. So this is what I chose to do, and we will see how it turns out.
So I started the long process of sanding everything smooth. I used coarse foam sanding pads for the curved areas and 150 grit sanding screens for the flat surfaces. I also used the contour sanding grips and a screwdriver to remove the paint in the really tight corners and crevices. Oh, also in this process, I sanded the paint off of the sides of the drawers so they would open and close easier, and because I like seeing the wood on the drawers.
Okay, it has been 5 hours of straight up sanding. I am tired, so I am going to be done for tonight. So there's obviously still paint. My goal is just to make it feel smooth, remove the texture, and hopefully when I go and paint over this, I'm not going to see any of like these lines where the paint starts and stops.
I also sanded the inside of the drawers smooth, but didn't worry too much about the insides. I just wanted them to be cleaned up a little bit. Finally, the next day I finished sanding, and then I vacuumed up the dust and wiped the rest away with a tack cloth. Since these nightstands are for my pink loving girls, I touched up the paint inside the drawers with more pink paint. I used Heirloom Traditions paint in the color Peony. The bummer about this paint and color is that it doesn't have very good coverage, so I painted 2 coats and could still see that I didn't get full coverage in places, that the paint chipped off when I was sanding. So I had to paint like 5 coats to get full coverage inside these drawers. While the paint dried, I put the drawers back in the nightstands and then mixed up the black Aqualock primer to prime these for new paint. I love this black primer when painting dark colors, and spraying it on creates a flawless finish. This primer will create a coat of even coverage so the paint doesn't look spotty. It will also help the paint stick and seal in the wood. Then I cleaned out the sprayer and let the 2 coats of primer dry overnight. The next day I could see all of the scratches and wood grain marks I accidentally made while removing the paint and other chips that it had from its age. So I filled all of those in with plastic wood filler and then I let it all dry. The next day I sanded the wood filler smooth and cleaned up the dust again. Then we moved them outside to spray with clear shellac. We let the shellac dry overnight and then sprayed another coat of the black primer over everything. I also brushed the primer on the edges of the drawers at this point. All right, I have 4 coats of primer on here. The reason I did the shellac was because I really wanted to block any bleed through possibilities since we sanded down to raw wood. I didn't want any weird stains coming through because we sanded down to raw wood. I am painting a dark color, so we probably won't have issues with that. But I didn't want to have any issues, so I thought, might as well, that's fine. And then I had put another coat of the black Aqualock primer on here because of the wood filler. I wanted to make sure everything had a full coverage where you couldn't see any of the spots where the wood filler was put all down here. Just a good, complete, solid coverage. So then that has a great base for the paint. After the primer was dry, I finally was ready to move on to the paint. I chose Jacob's Well by Melange Paint in their one paint line. This is an all-in-one paint with primer, paint, and built-in top coat. It dries to a beautiful satin sheen and it creates a flawless finish when it's sprayed on. I used the same Wagner Flexio 3500 sprayer. It's also the same as the 595 sprayer. To spray it on, I let it dry for a couple of hours and then sprayed a second coat on to make sure I had full coverage. Last but not least, a couple of days later, I put on new black knobs on the nightstands to finish off the look. Here's a reminder of what they looked like before, and here's what they look like now. I am so excited about these nightstands. I get to keep them. The color is perfect, and the tall, skinny shape of these nightstands are exactly what I need in their small room. I have a question for you though. Would you go to all of that work to remove the brush marks like I did? Or do brush marks not bother you? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget, if you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons to show us some love. And please share with your friends. We are so thankful for your love and support. So thank you so much. Are you confused and not sure where to start with your furniture makeover? Don't worry, I got your back. Click the link in my comment to download our free painting checklist so you can paint your furniture as if you hired a professional to do it.